thank you for joining me. My name is Susan Lawrence, and I'm an archaeologist in the Department of Archaeology and History at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm speaking to you today from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future, and to any Aboriginal people who are watching today. We do all our work on country that belongs to the Wadawurrung, Djadjawurrung, Taungurung, Yorta Yorta, and Doodarowa people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future as well. The time is January 1861, the heat of an Australian summer. Jacques Bladier was very unhappy. He was a prize-winning vigneron and orchardist with a prosperous market garden and prize-winning wines, described by his neighbours as the best garden in Victoria. But now all this was buried under 5 feet of mining waste. Hundreds of fruit trees and vines were dead or dying, and his property was nearly worthless. The town he lived in, Bendigo, was a booming mining community in the grips of the gold rush, and Monsieur Bladier was paying the price of gold. We can see some of that mining waste in the foreground of this photograph of Bendigo at this time. Australia's gold rush was the biggest in the world after California, and most of it was in the southern colony of Victoria. Hundreds of thousands of people rushed to the colony after the discovery of payable gold in 1851, and incredible wealth was generated. 2% of the gold ever mined in the world until 1914 was recovered from Victoria. None of that, however, helped poor Jacques Bladier. Mining was big industry, and when big industry has the ear of government, it can be hard to get their attention. Monsieur Bladier and his neighbours presented the government with a bill for thousands of pounds of damage, but their claim was dismissed out of hand. Tailings continued to pour out of the mines for another 50 years through community protests and lawsuits and government inquiries. All through this time, property, and especially agricultural property, commercial property, people's homes, roads, and so on, was damaged all over the colony of Victoria to no avail. This was, in fact, an unprecedented environmental crisis. It was the most widespread and intense industrial pollution that Australia had ever seen to that point. Over the period from 1851 to 1900, we have calculated that nearly 1 billion cubic meters of mining waste was dumped into Victoria's rivers, most of it between 1851 and 1900, but some in the following few years up to 1914. This graph, this map shows the results of calculations that we have done based on looking at documentary evidence kept by the mining surveyors and the mines department in Victoria over this period. And it has allowed us to calculate the quantity of mining waste that was generated in each mining division around Victoria. The city of Melbourne, where I'm speaking from, is at the head of Port Phillip Bay in here, and all these mining divisions around the colony had extensive mining industries. The size of these circles that you can see are the relative amount of mining waste generated in each district, and the colors represent the different branches of mining that provided the waste. So an unprecedented environmental crisis, and not something that was in just a few rivers either. In fact, it was all over the colony. This went on for 50 years, from 1851 right up until 1904, when legislation was passed to stop it. The red or heavy lines on this map of Victoria show the rivers where mining waste was a problem. And the length of the line represents the length from the distance from where mining was located, which is usually in the headwaters of these river systems along the Great Dividing Range, down to the location where complaints were still being received. And this is from a government inquiry in 1887. So people as far downriver as the end of those heavy lines were complaining about the damage done by mining waste. So in some cases, mining waste had flowed 40 or 50 kilometers downstream from the mines. As remarkable as all the damage that was done is the fact that this damage has since been almost entirely forgotten. It was only rediscovered as a result of archaeological research that we carried out on some of these goldfields locations in central Victoria. As we wandered around the mines and recorded the evidence of mining activity and all of these big holes in the ground, we began to wonder about where the dirt had all gone. These were alluvial mines, and there are no big piles of mullock or mining waste next to the mines. All of the dirt that was in these holes has simply disappeared. We wanted to know where it had gone, and so we went looking for it. We discovered that this dirt is still there in the landscape, but it has been transported downstream by the water that was used in the mining processes. This earth is still there lying on the floodplains, and it has created a new stratigraphic layer in Victoria along all those Victorian rivers. It is a massive anthropogenic landscape feature. And you can see here our colleague, Professor Ian Rutherford, pointing to the boundary between the gray, which is the pre-European, pre-mining underlying floodplain along this river, and all of that buff-colored material above Ian's head is the mining waste that flowed down into this particular little river system of Hodgkins Creek in northeast Victoria. And most of that material flowed downstream between about 1860 and 1890. This material, as you would imagine, has permanently altered the way that rivers in Victoria function. To begin with, Victorian rivers looked a bit like the image here in the top. They were braided channels, many of them, with lots of wetlands and multiple channels that the water flowed in, fairly shallow and fairly high up on the land. When mining began and washed all this mining waste downstream, the first thing it did was fill in all of those channels, and then as they became full, it overflowed and covered the floodplains around them. And so the river became just a sheet of water that flowed across the top of this whole area. Once mining finished and the sediment stopped flowing downstream, those rivers began to cut new channels for themselves. They went at least as deep or deeper than those original channels, and they left those visible layers of mining waste or sludge visible in the sides of these new eroded chasms. And you can see one of these channels here on the right, and the river today is right down in the bottom of this. All of that has eroded in the 100 years since mining ended in about 1900. So a huge change in the way that rivers operate in Victoria. It also buried considerable amounts of agricultural land, up to 700 square kilometers in one part of the state alone. The image on the left shows this particular river valley in 1909, and all of that gray material there is mining waste that has flowed 40 kilometers downstream from the nearest mines at Ballarat. And you can see the damage that it's done along the river itself to the trees as it's buried them, and they've died. The image on the right is that same location in 2019 when we were there with our colleagues. And you can see really the crop marks here, a different dog, of course, but still obliging to be in the photo. And you can see that line there that's effectively the mark between where that mining waste has covered the soil and the original ground surface of the floodplain soils. And this is showing in the side of the cut of the river there, that pale layer there is the mining sediment that covers those fields. This story of environmental waste and what was done about it is really a parable for our times. because the mining waste finally was stopped due to a combination of community activism and astute politics. And of course, that is still the way to get action. It was the work of this man, Sir John Bowser, the MLA for the little town of Wangaratta up in northeastern Victoria, and his neighbors who, through their agitation and Bowser's understanding of politics, was able to get a bill introduced to Parliament that, when it was passed, prevented mining companies from releasing their waste into the rivers, and they had to start taking action to retain that waste on site and indeed to begin remediation. So this is a model for exactly the kind of things that people still do when they see something that needs to be done: community activism and astute politics. But the lesson from this particular episode is that it was a long, slow process. That legislation was not passed until 1904, which is 50 years or 2 generations after Jacques Bladier and his neighbors were suffering damage from sludge in Bendigo in the 1850s and early 1860s. So that change did not happen overnight. But when the change was implemented at last, it achieved lasting good, and it brought changes that still benefit the community today. The Victorians under John Bowser introduced state-of-the-art mining legislation that became the model for regulating industry all over Australia and has underpinned mining regulation in Australia and New Zealand ever since. That regulation implemented changes like retaining the tailings on site using what they called slum dams or tailings dams. And they published instructions for miners of how to build these dams. They also brought in new regulations about having to remediate some of the mining sites when mining finished, so that they weren't just gaping holes in the ground anymore, but they were places that could still be used for growing crops and forests and so on. Having this regulation and implementing these changes to what miners had to do established a just price for mining. It meant that miners had to pay the cost of the damage that their work did. And that just price for mining accounts for the triple bottom line, as we call it today, for the environmental and social costs, as well as the economic costs. Because of that regulation, in fact, mining companies complain it's still too expensive to extract gold in Victoria, other than in exceptional circumstances when the price of gold becomes very high, because miners here have to pay for all of these other regulations. That means that they can only do it when the economic value of the gold is more than that just price that recognizes the triple bottom line. The environmental protection that we have today, that we see in this story of archaeology and past environmental crises, the environmental protection we have is part of our heritage. Not only are the mining sites part of our heritage and those anthropogenic layers in the rivers part of our heritage, but the legislation is part of our heritage as well. These are all legacies from our ancestors. When we think of our resource use today, not only from mining, but as consumers generally, we should ask ourselves, what kind of ancestors are we going to be? Thank you.